At 25,000 feet, the sky was not just empty, it was lethal. The temperature outside a B-17 bomber dropped to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a man in minutes if his equipment failed. Inside the aircraft, thin aluminum walls offered no insulation, only separation from the void. In the very back of the bomber, sealed inside a clear plexiglass enclosure, one crewman sat completely alone. No one could reach him quickly. No one could help him if something went wrong. This position was known throughout the 8th Air Force by a single grim phrase: the loneliest job in the war. On the morning of July 30, 1943, as a gray English dawn slowly spread across RAF Kimbolton, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crawled into that tail position aboard a B-17 flying fortress named Tondelayo. The aircraft would carry him more than 500 miles into Nazi-occupied Europe, deep into enemy airspace where German fighters waited in overwhelming numbers. Arooth was 24 years old. He had already flown 12 combat missions and had 3 confirmed enemy aircraft to his credit, yet experience offered little comfort in the skies over Europe. In the summer of 1943, statistics ruled everything, and the numbers were unforgiving. The average American bomber crew survived only 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners fared even worse. They died faster than almost anyone else aboard a bomber. German fighter pilots knew exactly why. Attacking from the rear gave them the longest firing window and the most stable approach. From the 6 o'clock position, a fighter closing at high speed could fire for several seconds before passing the bomber, pouring cannon shells and machine gun fire directly into the tail. The tail gunner absorbed the first hits. If he was killed or wounded, the bomber lost its rear defense, and the fighters would simply circle back and finish the job. Many tail gunners never even had time to fire a single round. The position itself offered no mercy. The tail compartment measured only 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. There was no room to stand, barely enough space to move. Arooth sat on a narrow bicycle-style seat, knees bent, shoulders hunched, surrounded by cold metal and curved glass. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in front of him, pointed backward through the plexiglass. Between Arooth and the rest of the crew stretched 40 feet of empty fuselage. If he was hit, if the guns jammed, or if the glass shattered, there would be no immediate help. The intercom might still work, but rescue would not come in time. That morning, more than 300 German fighters were already being positioned along the bomber route. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs waited at airfields across France, Belgium, and Germany. Luftwaffe commanders knew the Americans were coming. They knew the altitude, the routes, and most importantly, they knew how American gunners had been trained to fight. The doctrine was clear. Conserve ammunition. Wait until the enemy closed to 300 yards. Fire only when the shot was certain. On paper, it made sense. In combat, it was deadly. As Tondelayo lifted off the runway and turned toward the English Channel, Arooth settled deeper into his frozen compartment and checked his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. According to the manual, it was enough for a standard mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was wrong. He had seen too many bombers fall, too many empty spaces in formation, too many parachutes without enough men beneath them. He understood something the doctrine did not. A gunner who saved ammunition but died early had gained nothing. Before this day was over, Michael Arooth would challenge everything the Army Air Forces believed about defensive gunnery, and the price of being wrong would be paid in blood, fire, and frozen air at 25,000 feet. Stay with us, like, subscribe, and comment if you love untold history. Statistics ruled the air war over Europe with cold authority, and no amount of courage could escape their reach. By mid-1943, the daylight bombing campaign was exacting a brutal price. American bombers flew deep into enemy territory without long-range escort, relying on tight formations and defensive gunfire to survive. On paper, the B-17 flying fortress bristled with guns and promised mutual protection, yet the reality was far harsher. In the summer months of that year, bomber crews faced odds that bordered on hopeless. The average crew did not complete a full tour. Most were shot down, killed, or captured long before reaching the required number of missions. Every takeoff carried the unspoken understanding that survival was never guaranteed, only postponed. For tail gunners, the danger was magnified. German fighter pilots quickly learned that the rear of the formation offered the greatest opportunity for destruction. A fighter approaching from directly behind could remain in the bomber's blind spots for precious seconds, adjusting aim while closing the distance at terrifying speed. At a combined closure rate approaching 600 miles per hour, the engagement window was short, violent, and often decisive. The tail gunner had only moments to react, moments measured not in minutes but in heartbeats. If he hesitated, he died. If he was killed, the bomber was left exposed, and the rest of the crew would soon follow. Michael Arooth understood this reality better than most. By his sixth mission, he had already witnessed how quickly a bomber could be erased from the sky. Flying in formation off Tondeleo's wing, he watched another B-17 take a direct hit to its tail section. A German fighter came in fast and firing, its cannons opening up before the American gunner could react. The plexiglass shattered instantly. The tail gunner never fired a single round. The bomber lurched out of formation trailing smoke, engines coughing and sputtering as control was lost. Parachutes appeared moments later, 8 white shapes against the sky. One man never came out. Arooth did not need a report to know who that was. The official explanation was always the same. The gunner had followed doctrine. He had waited. He had conserved ammunition. He had done what he was trained to do. None of it mattered once the first shells arrived. German fighters were not playing by American rules. They opened fire at longer ranges, knowing that U.S. gunners were trained to hold their triggers. By the time the Americans responded, the damage was already done. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate with the engagement envelope taught in classrooms and firing ranges. Combat did not. The Luftwaffe understood the geometry of bomber defense with ruthless clarity. A fighter approaching from 6 o'clock enjoyed the longest possible firing window and the most stable attack profile. The tail gunner, cramped, isolated, and often half-frozen, was expected to track a rapidly closing target while under fire. Meanwhile, German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 carried devastating armament. 2 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns could tear through the tail section in seconds, killing the gunner and disabling control surfaces with a single burst. Bombers that lost their tail defense rarely survived long afterward. Within the 379th Bombardment Group, the losses were already mounting. In just 2 months of operations, 9 aircraft had been destroyed. 90 men were gone. Their absence was visible every time the formation assembled every empty position, a reminder that statistics were not abstract numbers but names, faces, and crews who had not come back. Each mission briefing carried the same warnings, the same instructions, the same insistence that discipline and patience would ensure survival. Arooth listened, but his confidence in those words had eroded. Sitting alone in the tail, staring through curved plexiglass into empty sky, Arooth began to question the logic that governed his chances of living through the next attack. The numbers told him something was wrong. Tail gunners were dying too fast. Bombers were being hit too easily. German pilots were too confident in their approach. The pattern was clear, even if no one wanted to admit it. Waiting for the enemy to close was not caution. It was surrendering the initiative. And in the skies over Europe, surrender usually meant death. By the time Tondeleo crossed the English coastline and began its long climb toward altitude, Michael Arooth had already reached a quiet conclusion. If the rules guaranteed failure, then following them blindly made no sense. Survival would require something else, something aggressive and something dangerous. And on this mission, flying toward hundreds of waiting German fighters, he would soon learn whether challenging doctrine was the path to life, or simply another way to die. The danger facing American bombers was not random. It was mathematical. German fighter pilots did not rely on luck or impulse. They relied on geometry, speed, and timing, and they understood the physics of air combat better than most of the men trying to stop them. A fighter approaching a B-17 from directly behind created the most lethal scenario possible. From the 6 o'clock position, the attacker enjoyed a long, stable firing window while closing the distance at enormous speed. The bomber, heavy and slow by comparison, could not maneuver sharply. It could only fly forward and hope its gunners reacted in time. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 closing from the rear at roughly 350 miles per hour gave its pilot nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. 10 seconds was an eternity in aerial combat. In those 10 seconds, cannon shells could walk methodically across the tail section, shattering plexiglass, cutting control cables, and killing the man seated behind the guns. The tail gunner had the same 10 seconds to respond, but his task was far harder. He had to track a target moving toward him at a combined closure speed approaching 600 miles per hour, while confined to a small compartment, often while already under fire. The imbalance did not end there. German fighters were heavily armed. Aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 carried two 20mm cannons alongside heavy machine guns. A single burst could be catastrophic. The plexiglass tail enclosure offered no real protection. When it shattered, fragments became shrapnel, tearing into flesh and equipment alike. Tail controls ran directly through that section of the aircraft. Damage there could make the bomber uncontrollable even if the rest of the plane remained intact. A bomber without tail protection was no longer a fortress. It was prey. American doctrine was built around conservation. Gunners were trained to fire only when a hit was almost guaranteed. 300 yards was the recommended engagement range. Anything beyond that was considered wasteful. Ammunition was limited, and instructors believed discipline would preserve firepower for the moment it mattered most. In a classroom, the logic was sound. In combat, 300 yards often meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time the tail gunner opened fire, shells were already tearing through the aircraft. Reaction time vanished in an instant. Michael Arooth began to see the flaw clearly. German pilots knew the rules. They exploited them deliberately. They opened fire at 600 yards or more, confident that American gunners would hesitate. The fighters did not need perfect accuracy at that range. They only needed to hit something vital, and the bomber presented a large, fragile target. Even near misses forced crews to deal with damage, smoke, and wounded men. The Germans were not trying to duel the tail gunner. They were trying to kill him before he could fight back. From his seat in the tail, Arooth understood that the engagement was already lost if it reached 300 yards. Waiting was not caution. It was compliance. The geometry favored the attacker, and the doctrine handed him time. Every second of restraint gave the enemy control. If survival depended on disrupting the attack before it stabilized, then the fight had to begin earlier, when the fighter was still committed to its approach and most vulnerable to being forced off target. This realization unsettled Arooth deeply, because it meant the training manuals were not just outdated, they were dangerous. They asked tail gunners to endure the most lethal part of the attack before defending themselves. The geometry of death was built into the rules, and every mission reinforced the lesson. The only question left was whether breaking those rules would change the outcome, or simply hasten it. The Army Air Forces did not arrive at their gunnery doctrine by accident. It had been shaped by years of theory, peacetime training, and limited combat experience. Ammunition was heavy, space was limited, and resupply in the air was impossible. Every round carried into battle had to justify its weight. Gunnery instructors drilled this reality into their students with relentless discipline. Fire only when the enemy is within 300 yards, fire short and controlled bursts. Accuracy matters more than volume. A calm, patient gunner was a living gunner. At least, that was the belief. Michael Arooth had followed those rules on his early missions. He waited. He tracked. He held his fire while German fighters grew larger in his sights. He trusted that the moment would come when training and reality aligned. Instead, what he saw was hesitation turning into catastrophe. Fighters did not wait politely to be engaged. They came in firing, shells reaching out long before the range markers taught in gunnery school. By the time Arooth squeezed his triggers, damage had already been done somewhere else in the formation. Engines burned. Control surfaces vanished. Men were wounded or killed before they had a chance to fight. The moment that truly broke Arooth's faith in doctrine came quietly, without ceremony. On one mission, flying in tight formation, a B-17 off Tondeleo's right wing was attacked from the rear. The German fighter came in fast, guns already blazing. The tail gunner never reacted. There was no return fire, no warning burst, no defiant last stand. The first shells shattered the plexiglass and ended the fight before it began. Arooth watched the bomber fall out of formation trailing smoke, its fate sealed in seconds. Parachutes followed 8 of them. One man never escaped. The tail gunner had died exactly as the manuals predicted he would survive. After landing, the official explanations followed familiar patterns: wrong place at the wrong time and bad luck. Combat was unpredictable. No one questioned the doctrine itself. No one asked whether waiting had actually caused the death they were trying to explain away. To Arooth, the answer was obvious. The German pilot had known exactly what would happen. He had relied on American restraint, and it had worked perfectly. What troubled Arooth most was not that the doctrine failed once, but that it failed consistently. German pilots were not guessing. They were exploiting a known pattern. American gunners waited. German fighters fired early. The result repeated itself mission after mission. The Luftwaffe treated the American training manual like a road map, planning their attacks around the predictable delay before defensive fire began. Every second of hesitation belonged to the attacker. Arooth began to replay engagements in his mind, measuring distances, angles, and closure rates. At 600 or 700 yards, a fighter flying straight toward the bomber presented a large, clear target. Its nose was pointed directly at him. Its path was committed. A gunner who fired early would not need perfect accuracy. Tracer rounds could be walked onto the target, adjusted in real time as the range closed. Even if the rounds missed, the psychological effect was powerful. A pilot watching tracers streak toward his aircraft was forced to react. He would maneuver. He would break off. He would lose the stable firing platform he needed to make his attack lethal. The risk was obvious. Ammunition? 800 rounds sounded generous until divided across multiple attacks. Fire too early, too often, and a gunner could run dry before the mission was over. The doctrine was built to prevent exactly that scenario. Arooth accepted the risk anyway. To him, the calculation was simple. A gunner who saved ammunition but died early had made a useless trade. Survival came first. Everything else was secondary. By the time Tondeleo formed up for deeper missions into occupied Europe, Arooth had already made a quiet decision. He would no longer wait for permission from a book written by men who had never sat alone in a frozen glass bubble with cannons aimed at their face. If the rules demanded patience in a situation where patience meant death, then the rules had to be challenged. The only question that remained was whether his defiance would save lives, or cost him his own. Michael Arooth's decision to challenge doctrine was not dramatic or announced. There was no speech, no confrontation with officers, no moment of rebellion. It was a private choice made in the cramped silence of the tail compartment, surrounded by freezing air and hard numbers. He understood exactly what he was risking. Opening fire early meant violating everything he had been taught. It meant expending ammunition at a rate instructors would call reckless. It also meant taking responsibility for the consequences, whether they proved him right or destroyed his credibility, or worse, his aircraft. The first real test came in June 1943 during a mission against the submarine pens at St. Nazaire. The formation was deep over enemy territory when 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s appeared behind Tondeleo, approaching from the classic 6 o'clock low position. It was the textbook attack. Standard doctrine said to wait. Let them close. Conserve ammunition. Arooth did the opposite. At a range of nearly 700 yards, far beyond what the training manuals allowed, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, sending streams of tracer rounds into the open sky. At first the rounds fell short, burning out below the approaching fighters. Arooth adjusted, walking the fire upward as the distance closed. The German pilots saw the tracers reaching toward them long before they reached effective firing range. The lead fighter broke off sharply, diving away to escape the unexpected fire. His wingmen followed. Neither aircraft fired a shot. The attack ended before it truly began. Tondileo returned to base intact. The bomber bore no fresh holes, no shattered glass, no wounded crew. On the ground, the reaction was immediate and skeptical. The ammunition count showed that Arooth had expended nearly 200 rounds in a single engagement. At that rate, he would run dry long before reaching targets deeper inside Germany. The crew chief questioned him directly. Other gunners shook their heads. Wasting ammunition at extreme range violated everything they had been taught. Doctrine existed for a reason, they said. Arooth was gambling with his crew's lives. Arooth explained his reasoning calmly. The fighters had broken off. They had not fired. The bomber had survived without damage. To him, the results were clear. To others, it looked like luck. A single engagement proved nothing. So did the next one and the one after that. Mission after mission, Tondileo kept coming home. Other aircraft in the squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the 527th Squadron had been shot down. 30 men were gone. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The criticism did not stop. Some tail gunners called Arooth reckless. Others said he was stealing fire discipline from the formation, creating confusion and false confidence. The manuals were written by experts. Who was one staff sergeant to decide they were wrong? Arooth did not argue. He did not try to convince anyone. He simply kept doing what he believed worked. He fired early. He fired aggressively. And his aircraft survived. By late July, Tondileo had already flown more missions than many bombers ever would. Each return added weight to Arooth's quiet experiment. He was not just surviving attacks, he was disrupting them. German fighters that expected passive targets were being forced to maneuver, to react, to abandon stable firing runs. The sky behind the bomber was no longer a safe approach lane. It was contested space. On the morning of July 30, 1943, as Tondileo prepared for a deep strike toward Kassel, Arooth knew the next test would be far more severe. Escort fighters would not stay with them. Hundreds of German interceptors were waiting ahead. If his method failed, it would fail decisively. This mission would not offer second chances. And for Michael Arooth, the experiment was about to become a fight for survival. The Kassel mission was different from the moment it was briefed and deep penetration. Heavy resistance expected and limited fighter escort. Everyone in the room understood what that meant, even if no one said it out loud. The bombers would be on their own for most of the flight, exposed to every German fighter unit that could reach them. Kassel was an industrial target of real importance, and the Luftwaffe would not ignore it. For the men climbing into their aircraft on the morning of July 30, 1943, the odds were worse than usual. 186 B-17’s lifted off from airfields across eastern England, engines roaring as they clawed for altitude. Tondileo joined the long bomber stream as it formed up over the countryside, the sky filling with silver aircraft climbing steadily toward the cold. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts escorted the formation, their presence a visible shield against early interception. For a time, their heavy silhouettes meant safety. But fuel limitations dictated reality. The mission would last nearly 6 hours. The escorts could remain for only a fraction of that time. As the formation crossed the English Channel and continued its climb, Michael Arooth watched the world fall away beneath him through his curved plexiglass window. The white cliffs of Dover shrank to a pale line, and then vanished entirely. France lay ahead, then Belgium, then Germany itself. The temperature dropped steadily as the bombers climbed toward their cruising altitude. Inside the tail compartment, the cold pressed in from every surface. Arooth relied on his electrically heated suit, knowing that without it, survival would be measured in minutes. By the time the bombers reached Belgium, the arithmetic Arooth feared became reality. One by one, the P-47 escorts waggled their wings and peeled away, turning back toward England. Their fuel gauges had reached their limit. The bombers pressed on alone. From this point forward, there would be no friendly fighters to break up attacks or chase away interceptors. Everything depended on the bombers' own guns. Arooth checked his ammunition again, 800 rounds. It was the same number he had carried on earlier missions, but this time it felt dangerously small. Intelligence estimates warned that as many as 300 German fighters were positioned along the route. Not all would engage at once, but enough would come to test every gunner in the formation. Arooth knew that he would not be able to fight them all. His goal was simpler and more desperate. Disrupt the attacks. Break the rhythm. Force the enemy to hesitate. At 11:42, the first shapes appeared in the distance, climbing from the southeast. At first there were 4, then 8, and then 12. Arooth stopped counting. Black crosses on yellow noses filled the sky behind Tondelayo, forming into attack groups with practiced precision. The lead fighters positioned themselves for high-speed dives, lining up on the bomber formation with calm confidence. This was not a spontaneous encounter. It was an ambush. The first attacker rolled into a dive from the high 6 o'clock position, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gunsight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. This was the moment doctrine demanded patience. Wait until 300 yards. Let the fighter commit. Trust the manual. Arooth ignored it. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The tracers leapt from the tail guns in long, burning lines, reaching out into the empty sky far earlier than any German pilot expected. At 800 yards, the range was absurd by training standards, almost wasteful. But this was no training exercise. This was a test of nerve, timing, and psychology. The lead fighter pilot saw the tracers first, not the bomber. They climbed toward him like a warning, forcing a decision before he had planned to make one. He broke off. The second fighter stayed committed, pushing through the rising fire. Arooth adjusted his aim slightly upward and fired again, walking the tracers into the fighter's path. The Messerschmitt rolled violently to the right, pulling out of the dive with its attack unfinished. No cannon fire reached the bomber. The engagement ended before it truly began. But it was only the beginning of something much larger. Within seconds, the sky behind Tondelayo filled with movement. Fighters came in pairs, then in fours, attacking from above, below, and dead astern. They rotated through the firing lane, each pilot trying to exploit the brief windows when the tail guns fell silent. Arooth never let that silence last long. He fired in short, violent bursts, not to destroy, but to deny. The tracers formed a shifting wall of fire that forced attackers to maneuver earlier and harder than they wanted. The Luftwaffe pilots adapted quickly. They switched tactics, attempting high-speed slashing attacks from the sides, then climbing away before the bombers' guns could track them. Even then, Arooth fired. His rounds streaked past noses and canopies, close enough to be felt. The message was constant and unmistakable. There would be no safe approach to this bomber. Minutes stretched into something unrecognizable. The attack did not come as a single wave but as a relentless sequence, one group breaking off as another rolled in. The noise inside the tail compartment was deafening. The guns rattled. The aircraft shuddered under the strain of evasive movement. Spent casings piled at Arooth's feet, clinking and sliding across the metal floor with each vibration. A sudden jolt rocked Tondelayo as cannon shells tore through the fuselage forward of the tail. The aircraft lurched, and warning lights flickered. Somewhere in the bomber, oxygen lines were ruptured, and the cold air rushed in violently. Arooth did not look away from his gun's sight. He kept firing, even as the aircraft bled altitude and stability. This was not the moment to stop. One fighter pressed too close. Whether by desperation or miscalculation, the pilot held his dive longer than the others. Arooth tracked him calmly, firing a controlled burst as the aircraft crossed the convergence point. The tracers struck home. Smoke burst from the engine cowling, followed by flame. The Messerschmitt snapped into a roll and vanished downward, trailing fire into the clouds below. Arooth did not celebrate. There was no time. Another attacker was already lining up behind him. The clock in the tail compartment ticked forward, indifferent to the chaos. 18 minutes. That was how long the attacks lasted. 18 minutes of constant pressure, of firing, adjusting, reloading, and firing again. When the last fighter finally broke away, the sky behind Tondelayo was empty. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Arooth checked his ammunition. Less than 300 rounds remained. Ahead, the bomber formation was scattered and burning. Several aircraft were gone entirely, reduced to falling smoke columns. Others limped forward, damaged but airborne. Tondelayo was still flying. The experiment had not failed. But the mission was far from over. As the bomber stream struggled back into formation, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. The Luftwaffe attack had been savage, coordinated, and relentless. It was exactly the kind of engagement the training manuals warned about: close-range fighters, concentrated fire, and overwhelming numbers. And yet Tondelayo was still in the air. Its tail section was scarred and punctured, but the control surfaces still responded. The engines kept turning. The aircraft had survived something many bombers did not. Michael Arooth sat in the tail, breathing hard, his gloves stiff with cold and cordite residue. The gun barrels smoked faintly as they cooled. He knew how close the margin had been. He also knew something else with absolute certainty. The manual was wrong. Not completely, not in every situation, but wrong where it mattered most. Waiting invited destruction. Hesitation gave the enemy time. Fear lived in that pause between seeing an attacker and choosing to act. Words spread quickly through the intercom. The pilot reported that multiple fighters had been driven off without firing. The navigator confirmed that the heaviest attacks had been broken early. Other gunners on nearby aircraft reported fewer sustained firing runs than usual. This was not coincidence. The German pilots had expected passive targets until close range. Instead, they had encountered resistance long before their attack geometry was complete. As the bombers approached Kassel, flak replaced fighters as the immediate threat. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, rocking aircraft violently and tearing holes in wings and fuselages. Arooth could do nothing against flak. He could only brace himself as the bomber shuddered through the barrage. The bomb run felt endless. Seconds stretched into eternity as the aircraft flew straight and level, the most dangerous posture imaginable over a defended target. When the bombs finally fell, Tondelayo leapt upward as thousands of pounds of explosives dropped away. The formation turned for home almost immediately, but the danger did not end. Damaged bombers lagged behind, becoming easy targets. Fighters could still appear at any moment. Arooth scanned the sky constantly, fingers resting lightly on the triggers, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. They came again, though in smaller numbers. Lone fighters and pairs probed the retreating formation, looking for wounded prey. Each time one approached Tondelayo, Arooth fired early and sending tracers outward like a warning shot written in fire. Each time, the fighters broke away. No one stayed long enough to press an attack. The message had spread. This bomber was not safe to approach. By the time the English coast reappeared beneath the aircraft, exhaustion weighed heavily on every man aboard. The relief was physical, almost painful. Tondelayo landed with battle damage severe enough to ground it temporarily, but intact. Of the 186 bombers that had taken off that morning, only 90 returned. It was one of the worst loss rates of the war. In the debriefing rooms, questions turned into arguments. How had Tondelayo survived when so many others had not? Why did German fighters break off early against some aircraft but not others? Reports pointed again and again to the same detail. Early, aggressive tail gunfire, and it was not official doctrine. It was not sanctioned. But it had worked. Michael Arooth did not claim victory. He did not demand recognition. He simply reported what he had done and what he had seen. Others began to listen. What saved Michael Arooth from punishment was not rank or influence, but numbers. The Kassel mission had been catastrophic. 96 bombers lost or damaged beyond repair. Entire crews gone in a single morning. The 8th Air Force could not afford to ignore any method that showed even a small chance of reducing losses. When intelligence officers compared combat reports, a pattern emerged that could not be dismissed. Aircraft whose tail gunners fired early and continuously suffered fewer sustained attacks. The conclusion was uncomfortable, but clear. Arooth was called in to explain himself. The meeting was not hostile, but it was cold. Officers wanted specifics, distances, ammunition usage, and timing. They challenged his decisions point by point, testing whether his actions were reckless or calculated. Arooth answered carefully, grounding every response in what he had observed, not what he believed. German fighters broke off when confronted early. They hesitated. They lost attack stability. He was not trying to shoot them down at long range. He was denying them the attack run they needed to kill the bomber. What surprised the officers most was not the idea itself, but how well it fit the enemy's psychology. German pilots were trained for precision. They expected predictable behavior. When that expectation collapsed, so did their advantage. Arooth's fire disrupted timing, aim, and confidence. It forced pilots to make decisions earlier than they wanted, at higher speeds and steeper angles. That increased risk. And risk made them break away. The Air Force did not rewrite its manuals overnight. Change in wartime doctrine was slow and cautious, especially when it involved ammunition expenditure and gun discipline. But quiet adjustments began. Training officers encouraged tail gunners to experiment within reason. Some units informally adopted early warning fire, especially on deep penetration missions. Reports improved. Loss rates declined, not dramatically, but measurably. Arooth continued to fly combat missions through late 1943. His reputation spread, not as a rule breaker, but as someone who had understood the fight in a way the manuals had not. Other gunners sought him out, asking questions, comparing experiences. He never presented himself as an expert. He told them what he had done and why, nothing more. The skies would decide the rest. By the time long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang arrived in force, the nature of the air war changed again. German fighters faced opposition from start to finish. Losses fell sharply. The brutal vulnerability of unescorted bombers faded into memory. But for a critical window of time, when bombers flew alone into hostile skies, small decisions had meant the difference between life and death. Michael Arooth survived his tour. He did not leave the war with medals that made headlines. He left with something rarer. Proof that one man, thinking clearly under pressure, could shift the balance of a fight measured in seconds and yards. The doctrine had bent. And lives had been saved. History rarely remembers the men who changed wars without changing headlines. Michael Arooth was one of them. When the war ended, there were no parades for tail gunners who survived by thinking differently. There were no speeches about doctrine quietly rewritten under fire. The official records moved on, focusing on aircraft, generals, and strategies that could be easily named and measured. What remained was something harder to capture. A lesson learned the hard way, in freezing air at 25,000 feet. Arooth returned home as he had served. Quiet. He did not tell stories of heroism or danger unless asked, and even then, he spoke without drama. To him, the war had not been about bravery in the abstract. It had been about moments, seconds where a choice had to be made with imperfect information and no chance to undo it. His choice had been to fire early, to take control of the fight before the enemy could shape it. That decision had kept his aircraft flying when so many others fell. The legacy of that choice lived on long after his missions ended. Training evolved. Air combat doctrine grew more flexible, more responsive to human behavior rather than rigid rules. The idea that initiative mattered as much as precision became central to air defense thinking. Gunners were no longer taught to wait passively for the perfect shot. They were taught to disrupt, to deny, surviving. The skies became less predictable for attackers, and unpredictability saved lives. The men who flew with Arooth remembered him not as a legend, but as a presence calm, focused and unshaken by chaos. In the worst moments of a mission, knowing he was in the tail brought a measure of confidence that no armor plate could provide. It meant that someone was watching the most dangerous direction. It meant that the bomber was not helpless. That confidence mattered. It traveled through the intercom, through the airframe, through the formation itself. When historians look back at the air war over Europe, they often focus on technology, better fighters, longer range, and heavier guns. But between those advancements lay a fragile period when survival depended on human judgment more than machinery. It was in that narrow space that Michael Arooth made his impact. Not by destroying fleets of enemy aircraft, but by forcing them to turn away, by changing the geometry of the fight just enough to matter. War is often remembered through its loudest moments, explosions, victories, and defeats. But sometimes, its outcome turns on something quieter: a man at the end of a bomber, a pair of guns, and the decision to act before being told it was allowed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your support keeps these stories alive.